We're very excited to have you all with us today. As we were introduced, my name is Brianna and I'm co-presenting with Mata today. We're part of Spring Up and we'll share a little bit more about our collective as we get into things. And we'll also try to save time at the end for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to jot it down. We're hoping to have about 10 minutes to get into any curiosities, but we also have contact info in the presentation if you'd like to follow up. I will pass it to Mata.
Amazing. Yes, so happy to be here. As a cooperative, we actually practice sociocracy. And so this is like a huge special interest, passion project of ours is always to be in spaces with folks talking about this and talking about the topics that we'll be getting into today. And so it's just such an honor to be here with other folks that are also invested in other ways to govern ourselves as we're organizing. And so yes, hi everyone. So let's do a grounding game because I know that we're sort of in the middle of the conference day. And so the way that this game works, and of course, consent, absolutely, please feel into if this is what you're in the mood to do, if this is what would feel grounding. If you prefer to do something else, like get a glass of water, step away for a moment, you're welcome to do that. If you do want to participate in this grounding with us, what we would like to do is to co-imagine the world that we want to move towards. And so in this game, we ask that folks utilize the words imagine, transform, and heal as the starting point of each sentence. So we're sort of weaving and writing a collective story together. So an example of a sentence could be imagine classrooms where puffy cloud beanbags is where people were learning from and they were able to take naps whenever they needed. That's just a silly example of what it could look like. So I'll put that prompt into the chat. And then if everyone wants to just take maybe a minute or two and write maybe one sentence or two sentences that begin with the words imagine, transform, or heal. And then I will read it off as our collective spell or collective story. We have about one more minute for folks to type in a sentence. And definitely you can begin sharing them too. Okay, I'll begin reading it. So, imagine a world where everyone has access to nature. Transform decision-making into a fully participatory collective process. Imagine people enriched by their differences, respectful of each other and non-human lives too. Transform our history and lessons learned on what not to do anymore. Heal traumas and injustices. Transform the way we relate to each other. Heal and transform how we relate to each other. Imagine a world where people are more connected locally and spend time together talking about what's important. Imagine a world where everyone felt seen, heard, and loved. Heal together through song, dance, play, and laughter. Imagine workplaces that are communities and communities that are workplaces. Imagine a world where everyone is truly equal. Imagine if healing support was available to all and we no longer needed police. Imagine a world where we are no longer in the trauma matrix and we can transform the world from a healed place instead of a broken place. Heal our relationships with ecology. Imagine a world where we are in sync and in flow with our fellow plant and animal kin. Imagine companies not owned but loved, transform enterprises into shared spaces, and heal the economy to serve people and not vice versa. Okay, we can practice using the emoji reactions. I definitely want to give snaps to our beautiful collective spell that we just wove. And I'm so impressed. These were so poignant and specific and beautiful in such a short period of time. So At Spring Up, we really love to center storytelling. And this is one sort of fun way that we like to do that is we're constantly dreaming up as a tenet of transformative justice. What can the world look like if we just dare to dream differently? That's sort of what transformative justice is all about, is about changing the bounds of and limitations of the way that society is structured and the way that we're able to care for each other. So thank you for joining us in that. And we can go to the next slide to tell folks more about Spring Up.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for that, everyone. It was really great to get to know you all a little through what you shared. We typically at Spring Up do a lot of our facilitation on Zoom, so Mara and I are very much at home in this environment. One of the things that we like to share with folks in terms of how we show up on Zoom is a set of shared practices, and we invite you to also adopt these to any spaces that you're in virtually beyond just this one. I'll go through them really quickly. One is that we always make sure that closed captions are accessible to folks. And so if you're less familiar with Zoom, you should be able to find a closed captions button on the control bar of this Zoom session. If you're having trouble finding it, feel free to message one of us and we can help you locate it if captions would be supportive to you during this session. We also always encourage participation in the chat. And so you're welcome to put emoji reactions to folks' comments or put emojis in the chat, use the reactions, whatever you'd like to be able to show how you're feeling in response to what we're discussing. The other shorthands that we have to make our virtual space flow a little bit more smoothly are first the plus sign, which we encourage folks to use if you're resonating with something that someone has shared in the chat or someone has spoken aloud into the space. We find that that's really a nice affirmation that keeps the flow moving, but also allows people to know that they're being seen and heard. And we also encourage folks to use the asterisk as a way of keeping a bit of a stack. So as we move through today's discussion, if you'd like to say something, you can put an asterisk in the chat. That's a little easier than managing raised hands sometimes, and not everyone knows how to use the raised hand function. So feel free to put an asterisk in the chat at any point, and then when there's a natural pause, we'll invite you to speak into the space. So feel free to use those at any point during our discussion. I see some plus signs, love to see it. We encourage you to put questions in the chat as they come up so that you don't lose them. If there's time in the flow of things, we'll get right into it. And if there's not, then we will hold on to those questions and return to them at the end. We want to make sure that this space is as much for you as it is for us. And so there's also a statement we include in most of our facilitation to really prioritize folks meeting their access needs. So please do what makes you feel comfortable and grounded in the space, including rocking, fidgeting, doodling, standing up, laying down, or turning your camera on or off. Related to that, if there are things we can do to help meet your access needs, like talking more slowly or pausing to define something we discuss, please feel free to flag that in the chat as well. And we'll do our best to prioritize collective accessibility and access during our space today. So now that we've kicked off some of the sort of table setting pieces of today's session, I'll take a moment to introduce us as a collective. I really love this definition of Spring Up, and so I'll spend a moment reading through it because I think it's very well worded. Spring Up is an abolitionist worker co-op practicing and teaching the skills to be free together. We cultivate a culture of consent and liberty for all through storytelling and popular education. So some of the ways that we do that are through consulting, coaching, and mediation. We also host 6-week cohorts for people who are interested in particular courses. We also offer day-long virtual retreats and webinars. And all of that is accessible on our online learning platform, which is called Blue Light Academy of the Liberatory Arts. Something that I like to mention in terms of our worker co-op structure is that we're structured in such a way that most of our members at this point are member owners, and everyone who's not a member owner is on a member owner track. So what that means is that Mara and I are co-owners of this cooperative business, along with many of the other folks in these squares. And on the next slide, I'll show a version of what our circles look like right now. This is a sort of pixely version of this, and so I apologize for the low image quality, but you can see here that we have a general circle We also have a number of other circles for the different functions that our cooperative serves. And so, for example, I work closely in the blue light circle as a self-described movement ecologist, thinking about the ways that different aspects of the social movements that we like to support might be able to benefit or engage directly with our online learning platform called Blue Light. I'm also a member of the member owner circle, where we talk a lot about the business and logistics and operational decisions that need to be made as a group. I'm also a member of our Getting Free Together circle. Getting Free Together is our 6-month cohort program that we run for organizations that are interested in developing some of the skills that we've developed as a collective over time. I'm also part of the consulting circle. And I occasionally will drop into the outreach circle, especially when there's outreach questions that have to do with our online learning offerings or with Getting Free Together, our cohort program. Mata, maybe I'll ask you to just locate yourself in this ecosystem of circles that we have at Spring Up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just wanting to uplift here too, this is the circle structures are based out of Sociocracy too. And so outside of the general circle, we have each one of our different projects. I am the mediation circle lead, and then I'm a delegate to other circles as well, which really informs a lot of the content and the perspective that I bring to what we're going to be talking about. So yeah, I think it's really cool that we're in this space, talking about a framework that we actually utilize in our cooperative, really as a community of praxis. That feels really important to us.
Thanks, Mata. Okay, so I want to ground us in this quote from Grace Lee Boggs. For those who are not familiar or who are maybe coming from outside of a US context, Grace Lee Boggs is a legendary organizer who's done a lot of really amazing racial justice and solidarity-based work, specifically coming from an Asian American Pacific Islander standpoint in solidarity with Black-led movements for racial justice. And so this is a really, really powerful quote that I love to be able to start off our sessions with. It says, "We ourselves must foreshadow or prefigure the tremendous changes we now need and yearn for in our daily lives. Practice the forms of social relations, decision-making, culture, and human experience that are the ultimate goal of our organizing efforts," by Grace Lee Boggs. I think the reason that this feels important to share, especially with folks invested in and interested in sociocracy, is because all of the prompt responses that I saw in the chat at the beginning of our session felt like really good examples and invitations to engage in prefigurative politics, thinking about how we begin to model the world we'd like to see in the future right now in the spaces that we have agency and access to. And so it feels really important to be able to share some of the skills that we'll be sharing with the lens that these are all things that help us practice the world that we'd like to move into, ideally operating from this idea of fractals, that starting with the small relationships that are immediately present in our lives helps for there to be a ripple effect, so that these relationships and models that we're building and working through are things that begin to shape other aspects of the world based on our relationships with others and their other spaces. So I really like to ground in that. This is one of my favorite organizer activist heroes. And so thanks for letting me share a few of her words with you all. I'll pass it to you, Mata.
Beautiful. So if you want to go to the next slide. So we'll be moving through 5 different skills, talking about what it takes to get free from our perspective and what we've been doing as a cooperative to sort of support decentralizing the skills that we utilize in our own plight, in getting free. And so the first one is learning skills to have proactive strategies to address harm. And so I'll read this quote, which is adapted from Bell Hooks, and it says, "A commitment to anti-racism or anti-violence does not mean that you will never buy into privilege. What it does mean is that when you make a mistake, you are able to face it and to make needed repair." Bell Hooks, one of our, radical education ancestors, who we always try to uplift their work. One of the most basic pillars and basic ways to start within transformative justice is to actually change the conditions of how we engage with each other in the moment. What are the care practices and the ways we're able to move towards harm and repair with each other? And so for us as educators and as facilitators that are really dedicated to liberation, what we try to do is instead of trying to control whether or not oppression and harm and conflicts are going to manifest in the space, the focus is more on how we will respond when it manifests. So we try to shift thinking about it as more inevitable rather than surprising, because that's part of the journey of unlearning and relearning and sort of collaborating in that endeavor together. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So in all of our live spaces, we have a two-part harm response protocol that we utilize in space that folks are very much welcome to adapt as well and use in your spaces. And so the first step that we invite folks into is into noticing and understanding. So some prompting questions here are, whenever a harm or conflict, something said or done in the space comes up, these are things that you would sit with. And it's, where do you feel tension in your body? Is this from learning new ideas that challenge me? Or is this because something said or done in this space reinforces oppression? And then, do I need more time to process this and identify what it means? Or do I feel ready to address it now? So once someone has gone through the step of noticing and understanding, if you can go to the next slide, please. Then step two is all about being responsive instead of reactive, responding and addressing directly what has happened. So we introduce this simple formula of, when X happened, I felt Y, and now I need Z. And we encourage people to use that formula either in the chat if we're in a virtual space, or to pull aside a facilitator if we're in person, to say it in front of the entire group. We can always go into breakout rooms with folks, or if it's after the live time, they can utilize our harm flag tool or in an email to us afterwards. And so this is a really critical part to how we try to create more liberatory containers and more accessible containers for being imperfect and for really being able to learn in a space with each other without so much of the pressure and of the shame that can sometimes come up, or of the awkwardness whenever there is something that comes up that rubs against someone else's boundaries or edges. This is our protocol that we sort of put out there in advance, and we say, this is a proactive strategy. I want you to know that we're going to take harm and conflict seriously. We're going to do it in a generative way. And this is something that we encourage folks to use. And so before we move to the next one, I'll share a really brief example that for me, when I was facilitating as a therapist, my non-monogamy support group, I was using the term clean STD tests. And someone used this, even though I was the one facilitating, they used this and they said, when you say that term, I feel that it reinforces stigma. I feel icky. I don't feel good about it. And now I need for us to use this other term. And so we were able to pause. I was able to sort of check my own somatic reaction as a facilitator and say, okay, let me kind of calm down, and see that we're just being called in about the terms that we're using. We had a brief conversation about the history and sort of why that term is used. We were able to create a new protocol of what we were going to say instead. And everything continued really smoothly in the space. And so instead of isolating that participant that maybe felt uncomfortable and didn't know how to bring that up in the space, they were able to really easily use this readily available harm response tool that we had set up in the space in a casual way. And I think it really made our container a great one. So we can move to the next one now, skill number 2.
Thanks, Mata. I always admire that example. And a lot of the language in the formula is borrowed from nonviolent communication, which we're happy to talk more about in the Q&A. But yeah, I think that example always lands when I hear it. So thanks. So the next skill that we're sharing and thinking about is making the implicit explicit, specifically as it relates to care work. So I think especially in a lot of collective spaces, something that happens is an unequal distribution of what we would describe maybe as emotional labor, or work that's focused on making others able to participate fully. So access needs getting met, tending to folks' emotional responses, those are things that are often forms of care and work that are relegated to particular members of a group who might hold more marginalized identities. And part of what we want to emphasize is that by being explicit and communicating directly about these types of care work, we are in a better position to make sure that those types of work are evenly distributed amongst all of the members of a group, especially in a sociocratic structure. So one thing that I like to highlight is an article that I wrote earlier this year after participating in student organizing. I'm a PhD student and have been involved in organizing both as a union organizer and in other spaces for a while. And I think that one thing that feels really valuable to recognize is that care is kind of at the core of any organizing project, or any successful organizing project has to involve care. So this quote says a lot about, I think, the root of care in anti-imperial organizing. But also, I want to just highlight this section as well, that the experiment that we participate in, for example, in encampment organizing, around caring laterally for one another without a hierarchy, is a mechanism to shift the dominant culture surrounding caregiving. So care becomes more reciprocal when we talk about it explicitly. Care becomes something that everyone has a responsibility to uphold and promote, rather than having that be something that's unspoken, secondary, or unacknowledged in the way that we tend to engage with each other collectively. So I'm happy to share the link to this article if anyone's interested in it. But I feel really strongly, as someone who also comes from a therapy training background, about the ways that we might be able to think more explicitly about care as a dynamic that we all participate in and something we can sort of promote more reciprocally. So when I think about care work, something that I want to emphasize is that we have a lot of resources about this at Spring Up, largely because many of us are queer and trans and BIPOC folks. And so we have at various points been the de facto caregivers, and also are lacking sometimes in our receipt of care. And so we think a lot about this partially because in collective spaces, it can be valuable to reprioritize and value care labor as it shows up, to also intentionally build a community and reciprocal network of how we care for each other and check in on one another. And then also to think about how this intersects with disability justice, thinking about things like universal access or mechanisms for everyone to be able to get their access needs met in any conversation, meeting, or decision-making process that we might be involved in, feels really important to really embody the sort of ethos of full participation from the members of a collective who need to be involved in a given decision. So we have downloadable tools for free on our website. I'll also include that link toward the end of our presentation. Thinking about resources that might be valuable, the two that I would highlight from our resources page are a How to Work With Me guide and also a How to Live With Me guide. For folks who are using Sociocracy in co-living spaces, something that we like to invite them into is a process of reflecting on what your needs and preferences and values are, so that you can communicate those as explicitly as possible to the people who you're sharing space with. We find that that makes it easier to negotiate what someone's needs, boundaries, and priorities are in a way that ideally is proactive and also guides the process of moving through generative conflict with one another. I'll pass it back to Mata.
Beautiful. And I know we're just zooming through this. And so just want to reiterate that if anyone wants to share any reflections in the chat, or if you have any questions come up, you're absolutely welcome to do that too. Okay. So we'll go into skill number 3, which is drawing on shared tools in conflict. Go to the next one. Okay, awesome. So we have a couple really awesome tools on our website that are available for free download. That feels really important to us in being able to decentralize these skills to get free together, is for us to have tons of free or very, very low cost resources available, especially online. And so this actually comes from our conflict analysis tool, where we have 5 different steps that sort of support someone who's navigating a conflict in understanding basically like what the heck is going on, like who are the people involved, what are the desires, what are the implicit tensions going on, what are the power maps and the power angles that are relevant in this situation. And this would be step 4. So this is looking at the scales of conflict, and the challenges that can arise from that. And so Drawing on shared tools of conflict, this looks at 5 different levels from which conflict can be looked at. So we have the personal level or the internal level, which is looking at conflicts within the self. Then the interpersonal level, which would be between individuals. Intergroup would be between different organizations or groups of people. The institutional level, which is within policies and practices. And then the systemic level, which is within culture and norms. And so, as I said, this is step 4 of our 5-step tool. And at each one of these steps, they sort of build upon each other. And what you can really see through moving through this tool is that mapping these different dynamics, mapping something like the scales of conflict, helps us perceive more choice points and what we have the power to influence as we're figuring out what the next step is in navigating conflict. So, step 5 is really arriving at that place of choice points, understanding what were the choices that were made leading up to this conflict, where are we at now, and what are the choices I have the power to influence, and then what are the choices going forward? What's all the realm of possibilities of how this can be resolved? And so let's see. So one of our collective members, RJ, who's a father, actually did an outlining for us to give us an example, utilizing a common conflict at home, which is recognition over childcare duties. And so this is how he mapped it out to give you an example. So the internal and personal level is I want to be seen as a feminist, ally, husband, dad who carries the mental load of parenting, and I want to be recognized for my actions. Looking at interpersonal, different ideas about what is the right way to do a task. So it could be things like cleaning, getting kids ready for activities, menu planning, things like that. Then at the intergroup level for this conflict of recognition over childcare duties, would be other moms and dads from the school community that perform these tasks in a different way and have different values around it. Then at the institutional level, it would be looking at things like bedtime, brushing teeth, and screen time. And then at the systemic level, it's the idea that women and femmes have been traditionally positioned as fully responsible for childcare. So I think that this really supports too, as we're mapping out how to navigate a conflict, understanding how something that we see as a systemic issue, so seeing the disproportionate value and responsibility of caring for other people and caring for children, we can see that as a systemic conflict and see sort of how it maps out across and down all those different scales. And that can really help us understand what's the root of this conflict and what's actually possible within this, is understanding where the conflict is at amongst all those different scales. And so on this next slide, please. What we would encourage, since we're talking about getting free together, is to invest in learning about and practicing conflict proactively. And so a couple different resources on our website include the shared definitions that we have up, questions to analyze a conflict. That's an awesome tool with 10 different questions in there to kind of guide where the conversation could start and where the reflection could start. We have an organizational accountability wheel on there too that looks at sort of 4 different quadrants, and understanding how accountability functions within the ecosystem. And then conflict tips and tricks, which is one of our Medium articles. And then we have a couple deeper dive webinars, which we have the titles up there too. And multiracial coalitions is coming up in the future. That's why it's in parentheses. So I'll put that link into the chat and we can go into the next skill, please.
Excellent. So I think that related to the way that we think about and analyze conflict, obviously conflict often has to do with a difference in power dynamics. And so part of what we like to empower folks that we work with to do is to name and think critically about the ways that power dynamics may be operating at different levels and scales in the kinds of decisions and conflicts that we encounter as a collective. So I think that these prompts are really valuable. And on the next slide, I'll get into a little bit more of how we define our sort of different understandings of power. But thinking about what implicit or informal power might look like in this space is something we really value. I think we all have been exposed to language and vocabulary about how we name certain forms of power and privilege, but I think there are other ways that we could think about power as well. For example, someone who's really charismatic might have more influence over a group than someone who's more introverted and shy. Also thinking about what references we're drawing on as a group, what kind of language or frameworks shape the way that we might all be thinking about something, and what kinds of things are assumed shared knowledge. How does that assumption about what we all understand a particular way potentially lead to conflict when there's actually gaps in the way that we understand something, or the way that we might be all using the same word but meaning something slightly different? We also think it's really important to recognize and uplift sources of power and wisdom that don't often get recognized as such. So, for example, I'm in academia, and I think that there's a huge value placed in this context on being able to cite sources or references or evidence that's produced in a research context, as opposed to knowledge that comes from someone's lived experience of something. And so recognizing that there's an important role for us to play in disrupting the norms around what kinds of wisdom and power are legitimate is something we really value at Spring Up. So here's a whole bunch of examples of different types of power that go well beyond the type of power that we're often talking about, which I think normally falls within this last category of institutional power. So when we talk about things like race and gender and sexuality and ability, often we're thinking about the ways that social, economic, legal, or political structures shape the kinds of power that are afforded to some people who hold particular identities in our world. But you can see here that there are a whole bunch of other kinds of power that might be at play in any given dynamic, whether it's a decision-making or conflict or collaboration dynamic. So at Spring Up, one of the things that we'll often do before beginning a new collaboration with a client, if I'm paired with Mara and one other member of our team, we'll try to have an explicit conversation about what types of power we anticipate might show up in a given collaboration dynamic between two or three of us on our team. So positional power, who's in a position of authority, maybe that has to do also with who's been around the longest or who has a particular title in a given situation. Also thinking about knowledge power, which I touched on earlier, who has wisdom, experiences, skills, or access to information that might also be related to how long they've held a particular position or been involved with a group. Thinking about personal power is something that often is linked to sort of personality traits, right? The way that we are maybe able to influence people or engage with people in a way that makes them want to listen to us or respond to things that we're saying. And then thinking about collaborative power, power that's based in relationships. So I think of this one also as being like, related to the network that someone might have access to. If you've gone to a particular school or worked in a particular place or have access to a particular professional organization, I think of that as a form of collaborative power. Which also can relate to, the ability to shut things down, right? Someone who has access to particular people or networks also often has the ability to put a stop to things based on not only their individual power, but the power of having access, for example, to someone who's on an HR team and having a close relationship with them. I think about this also a lot in the context of the legal system, that people who feel like they have access to, for example, or comfort collaborating with police, for example, have a particular kind of collaborative power that people who don't feel as comfortable engaging with law enforcement, for example, don't have access to. So we offer this frame in terms of how we think about power to invite people to think about nuance and complexity when we're engaging with different types of power, rather than defaulting to a really flat understanding of one person having power and the other not. There's always multiple dynamics at play when we think about and conceptualize power. And part of the way that we're inviting folks in our spaces to think about power is to think about power at all of these different sort of touch points, rather than thinking about power as an all or nothing black and white kind of phenomenon. I'll pass it back to Mara.
Wonderful. And we have arrived at our fifth and last skill that we're going to be highlighting before we talk a little more about Spring Up and go into questions. So for our fifth one, in order to get free together, it's practicing centered accountability. And so I'll read this quote from Stacey Haynes, which wrote The Politics of Trauma, a really incredible book that we reference a lot. And I'll put the link in the chat. And so The quote reads, "Our social norms tend towards polarization, blame, or litigation, rather than a nuanced ability to hold complexity and encourage accountability, mending, and justice." Centered accountability can hold complexity, both be accountable and know what is not our responsibility, while staying connected and in relationship. Often we will lean toward being under and over accountable. Over accountability is taking on blame, responsibility, and fault automatically. It is taking this on for people and situations that we may have wanted to be able to affect or want to now, yet we did not and do not have the power to do so. And then lastly, under accountability is avoidance of, dodging, deflecting, and or denying accountability. We are under accountable when we avoid affecting things within our spheres of influence or don't face mistakes and impacts we have had with good intent and responsibility. So a lot of the work that we do, especially because I am the mediation circle lead, and so we do a lot of restorative justice style mediations. We do a lot of TJ style storytelling circles and processes. And this is something that we talk about a lot is what prevents us from holding ourselves accountable. One of the things we start by looking at is the ways that we're socialized into conflict, the way we're socialized into accountability, and oftentimes, what emerges is that there's really clear distinctions in particular people, particular groups of people being socialized into being overly accountable, and then other groups of people really being socialized into under accountability. And so, for myself, in circles, something that I share sometimes is about growing up in a first gen household, being, Latina, firstborn daughter, those sorts of things, and how I was really socialized into over accountability. And so that really taints and shifts the ways that when I'm in conflict with my partner, for example, or in my workplace, or somewhere where it feels like there's people have power over me, I might automatically go into taking on blame or taking on responsibility and saying, okay, I'm going to adjust it in this way, even when it probably makes more sense to instead collaborate with other people as a way to take accountability and to figure out a better way to do things. And so that recognition is really supportive in moving towards centered accountability and being able to discern which part in this conflict has to do with me, has to do with other people, has to do with us together, and being able to map out what can how can we resource share, how can we be in solidarity with each other, and practice these skills of mutual aid and really being able to resolve conflict with each other. So centered accountability is one of the most important tenets, I think, in that process.
Thanks, Mata. I feel like we're going so fast. Like each of these could be like a 5 hour retreat. And so we're really trying to give you all a big array of things that we touch on a lot, with the hope also that you feel comfortable following up with us, which gets at some of what we want to just cover very quickly in terms of ways to keep in touch or ways we might be able to support and collaborate with you all in the different contexts you're coming from. So, Mata, if you're open to it, I'd love to hear you talk a little about our Patreon and our podcast.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we just launched a podcast. We're having really incredible people come on there, including a bunch of our mentors and our member owners as well. So we'll be talking about cooperative structures. We'll definitely be talking about sociocracy as well. Um, and we also have a patron that ranges from $5 a month to $100 a month. And that's really the most accessible way to get access to one-on-one coaching and group coaching, and to private containers with us, as well as getting all of our material that we've been writing over the last 12 years of existence. And so we have zine booklets, all different sorts of articles and tools and things like that that aren't shared as online as well.
And then this is my area of excitement, enthusiasm, and specialty. So I mentioned earlier, I work in a role that I've titled the movement ecologist role. And part of that is because I think that our Blue Light Academy online learning platform is a really effective way to dip your toes into a lot of what we offer. We have 90-minute webinars that are both live, and then we also share the recording with everyone who registers. And so if you're operating with a limited time frame or a limited budget, It's really helpful to have access to those as a way of zooming in on specific topics that we've covered. I think we have a care labor webinar that's actually free, but we also have a number of other webinars that are focused on things like strategic conflict or skills for harm response and how to apply those. We also have day-long virtual retreats, which are about 6 hours long on Zoom, of giving a much deeper dive into some of the topics that we've spoken about. For example, we have a retreat called conflict analysis. We also have a harm systems design retreat. And those are really helpful ways, maybe by yourself or with a partner from your collective, to get access to some really, really helpful like deep dives into the topics that we've been exploring with you all very quickly here. We also want to emphasize that for folks joining our retreats, you get access to a coaching session that is really often a useful place to talk one-on-one with a member of our team who's facilitated the retreat about ways to apply some of these concepts to your specific context. So we're really big on thinking about learning, but also application. And I think that the pairing of retreats and coaching sessions is a nice way to get a little bit of consultation about how some of these ideas might map onto your specific dynamics and situations. Do you want to touch on coaching, Rada?
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Digo. So we have individual and group coaching, and in individual coaching, our collective is really covers a huge span of different knowledge points. So we have therapists, social workers, herbalists, parents, all different sorts of folks on here. And so it's a space for folks to come and vent. I think it can be a really constructive, abolitionist, alternative space to what you would go to in a therapy session. People come in to role play conversations, to unpack previous decisions, to do strategic planning, all sorts of things. And then we also have group coaching sessions where we can really support with facilitating live feedback and building out systems that align with the values that you all want to center. Um, yeah, we can go to the next one. And then for mediation, this is my wheelhouse. And so we do one-on-one, which is interpersonal mediation, and we utilize restorative justice practices there. And then we also do group mediations where we usually will do focus groups or empathy interviews, sometimes turn it into a report, and we use RJ circle keeping and storytelling activities. We use art therapy, things like that, to help mediate and get to the narrative, and then also do strategic planning around resolving a conflict in groups.
Brilliant. So I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see folks who are on screen a little bit more easily, but we have about 6 minutes for Q&A. And I'll also drop a feedback link in the chat. We value feedback so much and would love to be able to hear what landed for you, what you're excited about, et cetera, et cetera. So that's in the chat, and now I'll stop sharing. And I see a hand. Go ahead, Eduardo.
Hello, and thank you. Hyper clear, so much to keep on working, right? It's just a few days of reading only from this last half an hour. But as someone who is going through this deconstruction path, I'm from America Latina, but I'm a man, I'm cis, I'm mostly white. Okay, so not about NVC, which is one of the pillars of our community. We have three pillars, sociocracy, NVC, and permaculture, our intentional community, which is confluency. I mean, sorry, that's not the point. I mean, not about NVC, but about transformative justice. If you can, I would appreciate very much if you can select a couple good books to start, or movies or whatever you feel it is inspiring, because I've been starting to read a bit here and there, but I would like to slowly go a little bit deeper into that. So a few references that you find inspiring or guiding or whatever, I would be super grateful.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we have, I'll also find it and drop this link in the chat, but we have a like reading list of all of the references that inform our trainings. And one book that immediately comes to mind is called Until We Reckon, which is by Danielle Sered. And she's someone who's done a lot of this work in Brooklyn. I came out of working in Brooklyn, and so I'm like very familiar with her. But a lot of her work is about departing from the traditional paradigm of punishment in response to harm and thinking about how we move beyond punishment also at the systemic or institutional level. So her program, Common Justice, works to divert people from the traditional criminal legal system for instances where they've caused harm to engage in a process that's more restorative or transformative. I'll also pull up links to a few of our webinars and trainings that might be interesting to jump into. We've recorded a few things on transformative justice skills and practices specifically that are 90-minute webinars. So I'll make sure those links are in the chat before we wrap up.
Thank you very much.
I put in some random recs too that I'm thinking of. One of them I wanted to start by putting a TV show because I think such a big part of transformative justice is us really daring to reimagine what the world could look like. And so I think actually if you're thinking about transformative justice, that doesn't happen in institutions and orgs and government. That's something that happens in community. And so I think looking at like speculative fiction, looking at storytelling, like your own personal family story and the story of the lands that you live on, things like that, I think is a really big part of understanding transformative justice and literally letting it transform your view of what is possible. That would be my recommendation. Yes, Miriam Kava, amazing. Cool. Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, I really liked what you guys said about setting the expectation. Sorry, really early in the presentation, you had like expectations of how we're going to work together, and then later on, you talked about how we're socialized to sort of be to have one perspective or the other, and that like power is binary. So I was sort of wondering like how do you sort of bring when you host something like this, how do you bring that into people who aren't sort of open to that as much? You know, like we have yeah, you know, like someone who hasn't engaged with this stuff before, like how do you bring it in a way that is approachable? Jeff.
Yeah, I can say, I mean, we do so much framing and reframing of what we're doing, a lot of meta facilitation, because the idea for us as a collective of consultants is for us to support people in seeing what it's like to have an embodied experience where we're trying to model using these tools and practices and then supporting people and translating back into their own communities. Okay, what can I take that will actually resonate with my audience and with what we aim to do with each other? And so like a good example could be grounding practices. There's certain communities that hate doing grounding practices, or people are like, whoa, we have to breathe and we're about to go into a meeting, or like I'm, a queer person that doesn't like feeling into the body. And that's going to really throw me off the rest of the session. And so I don't want to do that. And so I'll start by talking about the importance and how valuable it is for all of us to be committed to sort of regulating our collective nervous system and how important it is to center consent in that process. And people can choose whatever they want to do in order to ground, but we make space because certain people will need it in the space. And we all want to come as settled as possible so we can really listen to each other in like an open heart and really be collaborative and be kind of in our not trauma brain as much as possible. And so upon kind of using those types of wordings, then people are like, oh, okay, I can understand how this can translate into what I am familiar with. But we do a lot of that kind of work. It's a really good question. Like we don't want to make movements that are inaccessible unless you're a movement worker. Like that's not at all the point. And so I try to be really mindful of that. And I think coming from Miami, Florida really helps me with that because everyone I grew up with would not understand any of this stuff. And so it's about like a lot of the retranslating all the time.
Totally. I also want to just time check and say that if anyone needs the break before the next session, you should feel free to head out. But we'll keep chatting for anyone who wants to stick around. Otherwise, we really hope you keep in touch. We're on social media everywhere at Time to Spring Up. So feel free to also follow us and reach back out. Thanks, everyone. In response to that question as well, Adam, I think, something for me that really stands out is just that I think everybody's had the experience of being harmed or hurt. Like there's no way that you exist as a human being without those feelings, regardless of whatever kind of power status you hold. And so coming into this conversation from a place of trying to engage empathically with like whatever that experience has been for people has been really valuable too. So that even with, all of the social justice-y language that people might be resistant to, I think there's room to be able to say, like, we want to see you and your humanity, and we want to like start from a place of understanding empathically that like people who cause harm are also people who've been harmed. And that there's room to start from a place of understanding that experience of harm, rather than jumping into like a binary of like, you don't get it and we're right and you're wrong, So I think a lot of the work that we do comes from a place of being like, here are skills that we have developed that help us work better together. If your motivation is that you want to work better together with people, we'll take you. If your motivation is that you want to heal from something, we'll take you. If your motivation is that you want to figure out why this relationship that you had ruptured so badly, we'll take you. Like, I think that there's so many different entry points to the conversation that all lead back to the same kind of river. That feels like a really important thread to a lot of what we do, is that there's not like one singular entry point to these conversations that we're expecting people to come in with. I see Yodit has a hand up, and we definitely have time to chat through it before the hour. But again, folks, feel free to trickle off if you need to.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. And thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. It's the second time it's happened today. And I'm like, I must be with my people because folks are saying my name right.
It's a beautiful name.
Oh, thank you, Brianna. Some of us participated in a session on internal family systems just before this. And I'm really thinking about the ways in which, and the facilitator was like inviting us to imagine our own sociocracy circle of our parts, which, right? I love that. And so just listening to Eduardo's question about TJ and Adam as well is like, and you, Mara, talking about it, TJ happening in community. Like it made me think about my own circle of my parts and the parts that have done harm, right? Allow me then to do the work that's necessary for me to find both opportunities to repair where it makes sense and to restore, right? But beginning with the restoration of myself, that, when I knew better, I did better, right? And to be able to, forgive that part of me, to be able to, through practice and process, to extend that forgiveness to others. And in a boundary way. Not everybody gets that, but if we're committed to TJ, the ways in which that just really, I was making some connections between that last session and the stuff that y'all shared, and just really grateful for that, the self to systems process. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so moved by that reflection. I think that one of the core like tenets of the way we operate at Spring Up, I will joke often that I'm like a token cis person in the space because so many of our members are non-binary, and also so many of our members are like really helpful in pushing me to think in a more non-binary way, to say like things are not ever black and white, and there's room for all of us in our multiplicities, right? And I think what you just said about like tending to the parts of ourselves that are like that have caused harm, that are motivated to cause harm, right? Like there's a sadistic part of every person. And so getting in touch with that part and figuring out what that part's needs are and how to meet those needs in a way that doesn't involve like being your worst self feels like really important work that like aligns beautifully with a lot of the work that we're trying to do on a bigger scale. So I appreciate that. So much of what we emphasize in our work is like starting at the personal level before working at the interpersonal level to figure out like, what are my boundaries? What do I mean when I say boundary? How do I think about boundaries as like things that can shift over time? How do I think about like, working from not just a yes, no way of thinking about consent, but like a yes with some conditions or no except in this specific scenario? Like, getting rid of the idea that we have to operate from a binary and instead operating in a spectrum or like multi-perspective frame feels really valuable. For life in general. Yes, Inside Out is like such a good reference. The other thing that I think about with this is we have a free course that's called Resilience and Revitalization, and that might be interesting for folks just because it's a lot of artwork and a lot of like personal creative reflections from folks we've worked with. And I think that that's like another way of accessing a non-binary way of being together is like through creative practice. And so that's what I started thinking about when you were talking about applications of IFS too, which I'm a big fan of IFS. So I'm glad you brought that in. All right, we've got 3 more minutes if there's like a lingering question, but otherwise we really want to keep in touch with folks and also give you a break.
Hello.
Hi.
I had a quick question. I wasn't sure how to raise my hand though. I was just wanted to express a lot of gratitude to you both holding this space with us with the grounding, and I've been like typing really fast and taking a lot of notes, so just really grateful. The question I had for y'all is just if folks would be willing to share if there are any practices or revelations or kind of like key shifting points for you as you have engaged in this practice of transformative justice over time, or just kind of anything that got you like, yeah, shifting a perspective or an ideology or a practice or anything like that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, good question. I can jump in really quick and say that I think working in the context of Spring Up, which is a cooperative and also like not a nonprofit, has been like such a good counterpoint to existing in academia, because so much of my work in academia is attached to what I'm producing and outputting and how I like perform well as an instructor or researcher. But I think in the context of Spring Up, like everything feels really relational, right? Like I just went on a really big trip that was, you know, kind of scary for me. And everybody on the team made me this beautiful graphic of like a protection spell for me. And like, I think that in that context, it feels like I'm known as a person and my needs are known. And like, you know, I hate the like, you know, we are a family rhetoric. And so I don't think that's what's happening, but I think it is like, I am known as a full person and not just a worker in this collective. And that feels like a big revelation. Mana, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I think that my biggest reflection, I was thinking about this the other day, is that my relationship to time has shifted so much. Like building relationship with everyone in this cooperative, I just became a member owner, and so did Brianna and RJ. And RJ had been involved for 5 or 6 years. We're in our 4th year of involvement. And just now we feel that we know each other enough and we're committed in this really grounded way and have moved through conflicts, have moved through all of those initial growing pains where we were able to really give an embodied yes to each other. And when I do TJ processes, it's a minimum of 2 years. Like it takes so many seasons that you have to traverse in order to actually let change be something that's felt by you and by everyone around you. And I think that really relates to temporal justice too, which a big part of transformative justice, in the ways that it pulls from Indigenous thinking is it's thinking about how when you heal something within your lineage, you heal for all the people who weren't able to, didn't have the skills, the resources, the tools going back, and then you heal for at least 7 generations going forward. And so just that timepiece really sticks out to me as something that has shifted for me as a result of learning transformative justice and practicing it. And thank you for that question. That was such a beautiful one to end on. And yeah, thanks so much, Adam, for having us and for making sure everything went really smoothly.
Thank you
Thanks,
guys. You guys are
everyone. Keep
pros,
in
obviously.
touch.
Bye.
Thank you.